You're listening to Summit Church, where faith comes alive and Jesus is at the center. For more information, go to our website at wearesummit.ca or find us on socials. Thanks for connecting, and stay watching for this week's message.
Anyways, right, did you know that this Sunday actually has a name, traditionally? Do you know that? This is the Sunday after Easter Sunday. It's got a few different names. Sometimes, well, in the early church, the tradition was that Easter was actually a 50-day season. So this is like the second Sunday of Easter, like in some circles, they call it that. In other more kind of liturgical circles, they call this Sunday Low Sunday. It's pretty encouraging, isn't it? It's the Sunday after the high of Easter. Some also commemorate Thomas on this Sunday as well. I'd love to preach on Thomas. He's one of my favourite characters. Mischaracterized, in my opinion. Anyway, but we'll get to that another time. So for me, because of this idea that this Sunday is still part of the Easter Sunday, Easter kind of season, I want to carry on with some of the themes that we've been exploring, like over the last couple of weeks. So I want to focus a bit more intentionally on the message of the gospel as Jesus communicated it. That's what I've felt like the theme has been over this Easter season, is digging into what is the message of the good news about Jesus as Jesus would have communicated it. I have a sense that it's a really helpful thing for us to do that. Wherever you're at in your Christian life, spiritual journey, that it's actually really good to reconnect or reaffirm the foundational truth of kind of what Jesus communicated about the good news, about the gospel. I have a sense for me, and maybe for you as well, that the weight or the importance of that or the impact of that hasn't fully expressed itself through us or through me yet. I was listening to a story the other day of I love nature and I love wildlife and all that sort of stuff. I love taking photos of those kinds of things. There's a guy that I really like, a British guy called Steve Backlund. He loves to go all around the world and encounter dangerous animals and do all this kind of crazy stuff. And he was telling a story on a podcast about a near-death experience he had. They were kayaking in South America down this uncharted river. They came to, and they were scouting out all the rapids before they ran them, so they knew what was there. But they came to a rapid that was in a gorge that had vertical walls on either side. They couldn't scout it. And they were tired. It was the end of the day. And they decided, we're just going to run it anyway. We're just going to go for it. And so the first person went, and they just vanished out of sight. And Steve went second. And as he went through the first bit of fast water, he saw there was a big drop coming. And because of being nervous about it, he hesitated a bit and slowed down, and because of that, he dropped straight into the kind of the wave at the bottom, the stopper wave. He tells this story for about 5 minutes. He was cycling around, being pushed down to the bottom, back up, taking a breath, down, and just basically couldn't get out. And just at the moment when he was basically running out of air, couldn't breathe, all his strength was gone, the other person who had gone down before him had ran back up the river and thrown a rope and just managed to get him, basically, and saved his life. Now, he's not a Christian, but he told this story because the interviewers were asking him about moments in his life that changed things. And for him, having this near-death experience and that person rescuing him, he said changed his life from that moment on in every particular way. He looked at his family differently. He lived with different priorities. Whenever he was doing things, he was always kind of grateful this person had saved his life. When I heard him tell that story, I thought, man, is that how I live? Did Jesus save my life? That without him, without the gospel, I would have been dead. I would have been kind of lost. I kind of feel like, for me, that story kind of made me think about, man, how much, it's not that I don't believe the good news about Jesus, but how much have I let it impact me and change me? That really prompted me to think about that. I believe just being aware of kind of church culture, Christian culture, Western culture, North American culture, at times I think the gospel, the good news of Jesus has been distorted. And what I mean by that is if you imagine looking through a lens or a glass, you see things that are shaped differently. It just looks, when you look at something, it doesn't look proportional, right? There's things that are emphasized that shouldn't be emphasized over other things. And I don't want to be critical, but I just think that sometimes this distortion is dramatic and obvious, but sometimes it's subtle. I believe that this happens sometimes because people have their own agendas or bias. We emphasize certain aspects of Christian faith over others. And some, for whatever reason, I think it's just a human thing, but we tie up, or we risk tying up Christian belief with other beliefs about philosophy or even political biases. And so when I look around the landscape of how the message of Jesus is being communicated, I see a bit of a difference between what people are understanding about the good news of Jesus and what it means to be a Christian, and perhaps what Jesus communicates in the Gospels. And I don't want to, I want to say it's a large dose of grace, because I think many Christians are good intentioned and perhaps are not unaware that we've strayed from how Jesus communicated the gospel. And often the problem is not like right or wrong. Sometimes it's just emphasis in terms of the way that we communicate. A really interesting, if you want just an example of what I'm talking about, it would be the idea that communicating to somebody that to be a Christian, you would have to do certain things. Maybe it would be whether that's implied or communicated and expected, but just the idea that, well, if you're a Christian, you need to do this. Not just follow Jesus, but, act a particular way, dress a particular way, turn up a particular way, vote a particular way. Am I getting into dangerous territory? I just see that around, there's a lot of messaging. I just feel like it's helpful for us every now and then, or perhaps more often than every now and then, to actually be clear and affirm what Jesus talked about in terms of how he explained the good news. When I lived in the UK, one of the interesting things that we encountered was that the city we lived in Birmingham, was a place where there was a lot of immigration. The population of the city in Birmingham is probably still the same now. There was a lot of people from Pakistan. There were certain areas of the city that were primarily populated by Pakistani families. There was lots of people in that area that didn't even speak English. We had some really great friends who were Canadians who had spent time in the Middle East, and they spoke fluent Arabic, but they looked like me, So they would go into these areas and engage people in fluent Arabic and would just kind of completely shock everybody. They were talking about Jesus in the language of the people that were there. But one of the things that we would encounter, because I had lots of conversations with Muslim people about Jesus, is that these particular group of Muslims came from a certain area of Pakistan called Kashmir, and basically their impression of England before they came was that England was a Christian country. So every person they would encounter in England is a Christian. That's what they thought or were taught or were told. So then they came to England and then saw lots of people not acting very Christianly, should we say, or not kind of exhibiting things of faith. Most people didn't worship or didn't pray or didn't, whatever it is. And so there was this kind of disconnect with the idea of is Christianity really all that great? Because I see all these Christians not doing anything to do with God or religion or faith or spirituality at all. So when we had conversations with Muslims, oftentimes I would adjust what I would say. I would say, I wouldn't actually use the word I'm a Christian anymore. I actually started saying I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a disciple of Jesus. And we had incredible conversations about what that meant, what that looked like. And I had really interesting encounters with people about that. And I tell that story because for people outside the church, not only is the message of the gospel and being clear about that important for us who are believers, But for those who are outside the church and outside of Christian faith, it's important as well, because there can be so many different ideas of what it means to be a believer or to be a Christian, and there can be so much different messaging out there. That's the longest intro to a topic that I've probably ever had. But I want to take a couple of Sundays to look at a particular angle of this in the way that the scriptures talk about it, in the way that Jesus talks about it. You doing okay? I am too, just to let you know. Okay. So throughout the scriptures, God has used a particular metaphor or example to describe what it means to believe in him or to belong to his people. So we're going to look at Psalm 23. You can turn there if you would like. I'm going to read it to us. Psalm 23, probably one of the most well-known psalms of the whole scriptures. And I've got to be really honest, I kind of fought with this a little bit, to be really transparent. Because, man, it's like, I've looked at this psalm, I don't know how many times. And, like, I've preached on it a bunch of times as well. So I'm like, really? Again? Like, come on, Lord. Like, surely there's something more exciting. Oh, gosh. I'm just being transparent for a moment. And I got schooled really badly because of that. So, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You now anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So I've read this psalm so many times. I've kind of meditated. I've read books about it. It's been incredible. I've learned so many things. And I kind of, in my pride, thought, oh, man, I've looked at everything in this. I know all about this. Yeah. Turns out I don't know all about it. And there's two things in particular that were new to me this week when I was looking at this that I'd never seen before. And part of it is because I was reading a commentary on this from somebody who was like a Hebrew scholar. And so there's a couple of things I want to point out in this. Both of them in verse 3. When verse 3 it says, he restores my soul and leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So the first thing is that when this psalm uses the word restore, it has something going on that is a bit different to how we might think it is. It's the Hebrew word shuv. Shuv. I'm trying to make a joke about that, and it's just not a good idea. Okay, move on, Simon. This Hebrew word means to bring back home or to return. It even means to repent. It's often used in the other scriptures when it says that the people return to the Lord. It uses this word. They shuv to the Lord. The interesting thing is that this verse says, who is it that does the work of returning or repenting? It's actually the Lord. In this verse it says, he restores my soul. He is the one who returns me, repents me, brings me back when I've lost my way or I've gone astray. And when I was struggling with that, I was like, surely, hang on. Isn't it us? Aren't we the ones who are supposed to repent? Aren't we the ones who are supposed to change our mind and kind of come back? And I think that's true. But in this instance, it's the Lord who does that for us or with us. And I was trying to kind of struggle with that and think, well, is there anything else? Perhaps is this supported by anything else in Scripture? And I was like, oh, yeah. Jesus tells a parable about sheep. And what does he tell a parable about? He tells a parable about the shepherd who leaves the 99, goes and grabs the one sheep and returns that sheep home. I'd never seen that before. That there's an element in which I always felt like the Lord was always expecting me to do the work. But actually, lo and behold, he's also the one doing work in us and through us and bringing us back to him when we go astray. Man, I was encouraged by that. The second thing that I saw in this psalm that was new for me is in that same verse, verse 3, it says, he leads me in paths of righteousness. That's another interesting Hebrew word as well, magal. That word means not just a path that you might come across in the woods or in the desert or in the wilderness. You know, you can probably have this image of like a broad way kind of going through the mountains or whatever. This actually means the groove or a track that a cartwheel would follow. In fact, if you can imagine like a cart turning this kind of like this grinder of grain, whatever you call those things, the groove, because it just goes round and round the whole time, it makes a groove, and the cartwheels stay in that the whole time. That's what this word means. It's not just something that you can just wander off from one side or the other. It's like you're in the groove, you're in the kind of the channel. Like there's something about being in that that's just different from just wandering along a path. Does that make sense? And I kind of feel like that's really interesting, because if the Lord leads us in those kinds of paths, he sets us in a groove, he sets us in a channel that is going a particular direction that is not easy to get out of. It's you just go, and your wheels will follow that groove, right? Does that make sense? There's something about God leading us in a way that I think, again, gave me more reassurance of like, man, I don't have to always figure this out about where I'm going, what I'm doing. I just need to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus, and he's got me in the track, and that's it, let's go. I love mountain biking. I used to do a lot of it when I was younger. And at one time, I was going quite fast down a farm track, and there were these kind of wheel tracks. And I dropped into one, and I was going really fast. And I thought in my mind, oh, I could just turn my wheels and pop out of this. And then I turned my wheels, and that caused my wheel to lock in the track instantly. And I went flying over the bars and learned a very valuable lesson. The lesson being, if you're in a track, just keep going with the track. Don't try to do anything fancy. You know, this psalm, the Lord describes himself being like a shepherd to his people. That we are like sheep, he is a shepherd. Like we belong to him. He leads us, he restores us, he protects us and provides for us. So how does this then relate to the gospel message? How does that picture, and we could have gone throughout the whole of the Old Testament and picked out scriptures all over the place where the Lord uses this same imagery again and again and again. Like it's in Isaiah, it's in Ezekiel 34, it's in all these different places. The Lord calls himself a shepherd over his people. And one of the things I just want to sidebar in is just to be careful that we, if you've ever been around sheep, you know that sheep are not always the brightest of things. But I don't think that's the point here, because actually in this culture, sheep were probably one of the most valuable things you could own. They provided so many different things, from their wool to their meat, whatever it is. So in this picture that the Lord is drawing for us, if we are sheep, that doesn't mean we're kind of just some dumb kind of people just following along. No, actually, it's a picture of someone valuable, possessed by the Lord and following the Lord. Does that make sense? Just a little sidebar for you all. How does this relate to Jesus talking about the gospel? Well, for those of you who've been around the Bible for a while, you probably would have already spotted it. But in John 10, verses 7 to 14, Jesus says this. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me." So Jesus is well aware of all the references throughout the Old Testament scriptures where God is saying that he is the Lord is saying, I am the shepherd of the sheep. And so we need to make sure we don't miss this moment, because Jesus is purposely referring to himself as the good shepherd. It's a moment where, some people say, did Jesus ever say he was God? Well, this moment is Jesus actually putting a label on himself that throughout all of the scriptures, the label's been put on the Lord. Does that make sense? He's identifying himself the way that the Lord identified himself throughout the whole of the Old Testament scriptures. And so he's saying, I am the one who is the shepherd of the sheep, and so it's an invitation for you to follow me, to come. And there's a couple of things in this short passage we could delve into lots, but a couple of things to point out is that, first of all, Jesus contrasts the experience of life very simply between himself and the thief. The thief in this passage has got a couple of different meanings. Firstly, it's false shepherds or false leaders who don't care about people, they only care about themselves and their own kind of like leadership or kind of ministry or whatever it is. And there's a criticism in the Old Testament about those who act that way. And so the thief here is the one that comes to steal and kill and destroy. And secondly, Jesus is exposing the one behind it all, which throughout the scriptures has got different names: the accuser, the deceiver, the Satan, adversary. In contrast, the good shepherd has come to give life, and life abundant. The thief has come to steal, kill, and destroy. So for us, I think it's just to be careful of those who attribute to God the workings of stealing, killing, and destroying, because Jesus says here, the thief comes to kill and destroy, and I'm the good shepherd, I come to bring life. There's more nuance and theology around that, but we don't have time for it here and now. But it's an interesting thing for me that the part of the gospel is that I've come to give life. I've come to give abundant life. It's the thief who comes to steal and kill and destroy. And then Jesus describes the invitation here to those who would hear him. He says, if anyone enters by me, they will be saved. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and I came that we may have life abundant. So Jesus is taking this picture that the Lord has used throughout all the scriptures and applying it to himself and saying, hey, I am the good shepherd. If you come and enter through me, then you will find life. What is the response of a sheep to a shepherd? I want to say this: if you want to be with Jesus, following comes first. That's the response of a sheep. The sheep follows the shepherd. The sheep doesn't sign up for an 8-week introductory course to Christianity. The sheep doesn't then kind of like roll up like as a member of something and starts kind of like giving money to things or whatever it is. And I'm kind of obviously exaggerating to make a point, but the sheep doesn't vote a particular way. The sheep doesn't go, whatever it is, whatever we list off, right? But what does the sheep do? The first thing the sheep does is follow. That's what they do. That's the invitation. That's what it means to belong to God's people. That's the heart of the gospel. Jesus says, follow me. That's the emphasis. It's not that other things won't come as you follow Jesus. It's not that your actions won't change or your morality. It's not that there's no requirement for you to change, but it's the emphasis that's important. It's that actually following him is the first thing to do. Everything else comes after that. I think that's the problem. We've sometimes lost that emphasis, perhaps. The emphasis isn't first on a set of laws and regulations. It isn't on attendance or an institution or community. The emphasis isn't on adopting a particular moral framework or a set of doctrines. The emphasis isn't first on a set of practical actions and lifestyle choices. The emphasis is on following Jesus. All of those will come as you follow Jesus, but they are not Jesus' emphasis when talking about being with him and being part of his people. What did he say in Matthew 16? Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and what? Follow me. I would say that act of following him is something we don't graduate from. We don't move on from it. We don't kind of get to a place where I've done Christianity 101, now I'm at 102, and that's behind, I'm doing something else now. I think that's actually something that is a consistent theme throughout all of our life of being God's people, is actually being people who follow him. Seems like today's Confession Sunday, so let's go with another story. Recently this came home for me because I was kind of struggling with a few things in my life that, in fact, it all started. Oh, this is going to be good. Okay. I actually had a recurring dream. And I hadn't eaten too much pizza before I went to sleep. I know there's dreams that I have that are dreams that have significance or meaning. And I believe that through the scriptures it's clear that God speaks through dreams at times. I had this dream that I was in a vehicle going down steep roads or paths, and no matter what I did, I could press the brake and it wouldn't stop. I couldn't avoid going off over cliffs or going into things. No matter how hard I tried, I was pressing the brake as hard as I could. I was steering as hard as I could. Nothing worked, basically. I was trying to avoid things, and I was in control. After a while, probably too long, I actually decided to pray about it and ask the Lord what it was all about. It's a novel idea, isn't it? And actually the Lord said to me, this dream is about the fact you're struggling to control things. You're trying to control either the life around you or your life or yourself. And you're getting anxious because you realize you can't. And then he said, you're not really supposed to be controlling things. You're supposed to be just following me. Good confession time this morning. Stop trying to control stuff and actually start following instead. And it's not that control, there's a fruit of the Spirit, is self-control. But I think sometimes, for me personally, I was thinking that, man, if I can control everything around me, I'll be fine. Things will work out. God will get what he wants. I'll get what I want. And that says it's just doesn't work. So for me, there was a thing here where I needed to recalibrate. One of the things I love about being a pastor and preaching on Sunday is that sometimes it's a bit like a kind of a therapy session. For me, with you all, I'm just kind of going through the things the Lord has shown me and hoping to pass that on somehow. My kind of feeling or my kind of sense is that for some of us, this idea of kind of the gospel or the message of Jesus being about like we're supposed to follow him, and that's supposed to be the most important, that's the thing that comes first. Everything else can come after that. But the thing to be reminded of is to be actually we're supposed to follow Jesus. And I think that sometimes we need to it's not that we don't know that, but there needs to be a kind of a recalibration. Does that make sense? That's what it felt like for me. I needed to recalibrate something in my life to get back to like actually following Jesus. Day by day, each moment, thinking about what's Jesus leading me to in this moment? So I think maybe the call today is simply, for some of us, I wonder whether the Holy Spirit is calling you to recalibrate. Perhaps back from activity to relationship. Not just believing the right things, not just living a Christian life, but walking with Jesus again, step by step, voice by voice, moment by moment. So I'll suggest a few questions that you might want to ask yourself or ask of Jesus. Like, Jesus, where are you leading me? Do you ever ask that? That's something I'm going to start asking more and more now. I've had this moment. When the Lord gives you a slap around the face and a hug at the same time? Yeah, that's kind of how it feels. Yeah. If you didn't hear that, it was a suggestion to actually do that with each other. I'm not sure. We might get in the papers if we start doing that kind of stuff. The question that I think I'm going to ask more and more is, Jesus, where are you leading me? And then I might ask her other questions like, in this area of my life, what does following Jesus look like? In this area of my life, what does following Jesus look like? I'm honest that sometimes there are things that I kind of think, oh, well, Jesus is going to be concerned about that. So I'll definitely ask him about that. But there's things I just kind of go about my own day, my own business, doing whatever I feel is right. But actually, I think Jesus wants us to follow him in those things as well. Maybe that feels extreme, but actually I think Jesus is interested in every part of our life, not just the things that we think are spiritual or he's concerned with. There's other stuff too. In this area of my life, what does following Jesus look like? Another question, am I spending time discovering where he's leading me? Am I just going along, just trusting that it'll all work out? If he wants me to go a particular direction, he'll figure it out. I don't know whether that's the image that we see. The shepherd calls to the sheep following. Am I okay with following and trusting even if I don't understand? There's been moments in our life, we joke about this every now and then, but it's not all that funny. But we say, Zoe and I have said, like, there's been significant times in our life where we've been like, Jesus, we'll say yes to whatever you ask us to do. And then after that, you realize what he's asking you to do, and then you regret saying that. We don't really regret it, but we just kind of play with the idea. But that's a kind of an interesting moment. I think times that Jesus asks us to follow into certain moments without necessarily understanding kind of what the full implications of that's going to be. But we need to trust him that he's got the best in mind for us. Psalm 23 talks about how he leads us beside still waters, by pastures, like things that are good for us, even through the valley of the shadow of death, that he leads us through that. And then he sets a table before our enemies. Like, there's all these pictures of the way that he leads us through different seasons of life. But are we okay to do that? Do we trust him really? So that's what I have for us this morning. This kind of idea. And I want to follow up this next week because there's a hint in that passage that we just read where Jesus is talking about being the good shepherd. And there's a little moment he says, my sheep hear my voice. So if you want to come back next week, I think we need to talk about that. What does that look like? How does that happen? What does hearing his voice look like? Because that really helps. If you hear his voice, well, it helps when he asks you to do something that you want to do. When he asks you to do something you're uncomfortable with, you have a decision to make. But we'll talk about that next week, if that hasn't kind of like... Yeah, anyway. So, worship team, come up. Let's pray together.